At a loss for gift ideas for the special dancer in your life? Stressed about Secret Santa gifting? Stress no more. Jewel Dancewear's best-selling meshy crop tops and tights come in a gorgeous array of dusty jewel tones that stun. You may find yourself wanting them in every color, so if you can't decide, go the gift card route at jeweldancewear.com. As a special holiday treat for Conversations on Dance listeners, use code HOHOHO15 for 15% off your entire order. More information is in the description of this episode. The holidays are right around the corner, and if you are looking for a great gift for the dance lover in your life, we have the perfect place to start. As longtime listeners know, we have covered so many great dance books on the podcast, so we have compiled a list of our absolute favorites. Check out our COD reading list at the link in the description of this episode or on our website, conversationsondancepod.com. This list has over 20 titles from friends of the pod and some of our longtime favorites for essential reading. Support Friends of the Pod this holiday season while supporting us too. Shop the COD reading list now. Our friends at Trey McIntyre Projects have launched a new website, but it's not what you think. TreyCool.com, spelled TreyCool.com, is a curated fun house of what is happening in creativity in the digital realm. It's a non-linear dive into the unknown, organized by serendipity and happy surprises. New posts every day, Monday through Friday. Check out TreyCool.com for a daily dose of fun and inspiration. I'm Rebecca King-Ferraro.
And I'm Michael Sean Breeden, and you're listening to Conversations on Dance.
As Nutcracker performances return to stages around the world, we decided to celebrate the return of the beloved classic by chatting with friend of the pod, Alastair Macaulay. As a historian of the performing arts and the former chief dance critic of the New York Times, Alastair has a wealth of information to share with us about the history of this ballet that has become a staple for schools and companies across the country. We chat about the ballet's origins, elements of the production that have been lost over time, different versions Alastair has reviewed, and finally he tells us which production he finds to be the best. For his current musings on dance and the performing arts, visit alastairmacaulay.com or visit the link in the description of this episode. Hi, Alastair. How are you?
Rebecca, lovely to speak to you. Lovely to see you.
Great
it's so nice to have you back. How many times have you been on at this point?
I haven't dared count.
A perennial favorite. So.
It's a great honor always.
Well, for today, we're going to explore the Nutcracker, which is a subject, I think anyone who listens to our podcast is quite familiar with, but we wanted to delve into, of course, its history, which is a subject that I think you have a pretty decent grasp on. So especially since, it feels especially relevant last year, most Nutcrackers were unable to happen due to COVID. So we're all, it's kind of nice to have that year off because I think everyone's excited again about it. We don't have Nutcracker fatigue this year.
Right.
So let's just start with from the beginning and get a little bit of info about how.
Let me just ask you, because you two have been dancers. Do you get Nutcracker fatigue before you start a season, or do you just get it when you've done 12 or more Nutcrackers?
You know what's funny? So this past weekend, Miami City Ballet was in Washington, D.C. doing the Nutcracker. I wasn't able to be there, but Michael went and some of our other friends who are retired went. And I was talking, Michael, to our friend Lexi, and I was like, how did you do? Seeing the ballet after you've retired. It was one of her first times because of COVID. And she's like, I don't know. I just started crying. And we were texting about how it's funny because you, in the moment, kind of hate it so much, but then also Nutcracker is like the one that hits home after you're done. I think it's just because it's like you do it every single year. So there's like a real nostalgia for it, I feel like, every year. Don't you think, Mikey?
It is, I have to say, a much more American ballet than it is a European or British ballet.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
The worst productions are probably Russian ones, ironically. They really are terrible. None of them follow the original scenario. They usually, Russian productions, have little Clara or Marie growing up to become her adult self in the Sugar Plum, often with the same ballerina. And I'm never very keen on that. It can be very well done. I think the best version of that one is the Ratmansky one, who has children, but then you see them change during Act One into their adult selves just as a vision, and then it happens again for the Grand Pas de Deux.
Right.
That's a really good point, because there are so many versions too within, not just of the dancing, but within the story as well. So let's talk about how it kind of originated. What was the first version of that kind of story?
Well, there's a lot we still don't quite know the details, and the particular strange thing is the ending. I mean, when I 11 years ago did a Nutcracker marathon of America, I always used to think the good thing each time was, how does it end? Well, the one thing I've never seen is how it originally ended. I'm jumping to the chase here, but the original 1892 production ended with, I think, a drop curtain coming down in front of the vision of the Sugar Plum's Kingdom of Sweets. And suddenly you saw the Kingdom of Sweets as if from outside, as if it was a magic hive with dancing bees in the foreground. I think they were children from the Mariinsky school. So suddenly you've seen one kind of sweets, and then you see a vision of honey being made, I suppose, by bees.
Oh, interesting.
So strange. I mean, it's a pretty strange story, so may as well have a strange ending, I guess.
That's true.
To answer your question properly, what was in the mind of them in 1892? Well, what's fascinating is what's unusual. Most of the ballets we've been watching tend to be, or many of them in Russia, are about princes and princesses, and this is about a middle-class family.
Oh, true.
Most of the ballets, almost all the ballets that survive from the 19th century are about love. Nutcracker is not really about love at all. Of course, many versions change it into a love story, but that's not what the makers of the ballet had in mind, and I find it works really well without any love. It may be implicit. There's a great friendship that grows that is huge between the child Clara and Marie and her Nutcracker prince friend, and of course we see some kind of celestial harmony between the Sugar Plum Fairy and her cavalier. But it doesn't need to be romantic love in either of those relationships. I find it better when it's not. So that's what's part of unusual. And the fact that it's a ballet about childhood is really unusual. With a child protagonist, Clara, as she originally was called by Petipa, Marie, as she is in the Hoffman story. And as you know, she goes on this magical mystery tour. And there are... People who don't know the Nutcracker think it's going to be a really kitsch ballet, don't they? Because they think it's all about kiddies and about sweeties. And I was just thinking today, I think there are 5 bits of music that blow your mind, that take it way out of the scale. I don't think even Petipa had any idea what Tchaikovsky was going to come up with. The first is, of course, the amazing Christmas tree music. And there's no dancing. You just hear the same da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da going up and up and up. It seems forever. And all you see is scenery change in a great production. That's what happens in the traditional version, sort of, at the Royal Ballet. And that's what happens, as you know, in the Balanchine and many other American productions. Then perhaps the most phenomenal bit of music in the score, and the most ambiguous, is what I call the transformation music. And people around America tend to call it the snow pas, because it's often a pas de deux for the Snow Queen and her king or whatever. But really, Tchaikovsky, I think, just intended this to be scene change music. And there may not have been anybody on stage, as far as we know. Quite often, it's been a mixture of scenery change and some dancing. I wish I'd gone to the ballet a little bit earlier in my life, because I missed the old festival ballet production, which began in 1951 with designs by the great Alexandre Benoit, who had worked with Diaghilev. And I think he reproduced something like he'd known in Russia. And apparently just the effect of one scenery going up and then another was just the most thrilling thing. Though there was a pas de deux in the foreground, you kind of didn't look at the pas de deux because just the great thing was the scenery. And then, of course, those of you who know Balanchine just knows that he is the one person who dares not to have any dancing. as Tchaikovsky and Petipa intended.
So I was thinking about that. Like in Balanchine's version, of course, like you're mentioning, it was just those scene changes in those moments. What do we know, if anything? Did Balanchine know that? Did he research that? Was that instinctually what he wanted?
Would have known the notes that Petipa sent to Tchaikovsky, and we have quite a clear plan of action in the Tchaikovsky score for what Tchaikovsky expected. Balanchine didn't follow Tchaikovsky's action in every detail. I mean, for example, after what we call the March of the Choice Soldiers in the party in Act One, for the sort of march for the little boys, there's a new bit of music that was intended as the entry of characters called the incroyables, which is a French word meaning the unbelievables. And if you look up incroyable, this was a particular form of French absurd high fashion in the early 19th century. Oh. And these people are coming in fancy dress to the Christmas party, incroyable fancy dress. And Tchaikovsky absolutely meant that. Petipa particularly knew what he was going to do. I've never seen a production that has incroyable.
Huh. So funny.
I have seen one or two American productions that had new party guests, adult party guests, arriving at that moment, and that feels really right. Right. Most productions just go on with the guests, the children that we know.
Right. That's so interesting. Can we talk a little bit about just how this project even got off the ground? Who decided that the Nutcracker would make an interesting ballet to begin with? Was it a particularly popular book or story? Or
well, of course, it begins with a great story. Was it written, I always forget the date, 1816, by E.T.A. Hoffmann. And E.T.A. Hoffmann, who also wrote the story, which is the basis of Coppelia, was one of the great romantic fantasist stories. He was also, by the way, a composer and a critic in the early 19th century. Oh. And there's a streak of darkness in his kind of fantasy novels that appealed to the Russians immensely. There wasn't like anything else in fiction that they knew. And that's why Delibes made Coppelia, and that's why Tchaikovsky and his colleagues made the Nutcracker. And Tchaikovsky, of course, was doing this as a sequel to The Sleeping Beauty and to the opera of The Queen of Spades. And The Queen of Spades is a fabulous opera with a lot of darkness in it. Mm-hmm. Quite sort of psychotic edge in it, which is fabulous. Mm-hmm. They were looking for the next work to do. And they not only did the Nutcracker, they did it as a double bill with Tchaikovsky's opera Yolanta. So it's a long double bill. Yolanta, I think, is about 90 minutes long, and I think it's usually done in one act. And if you listen to it, the first half is a bit stodgy, but actually it then grows and it becomes, if you see a good production, a kind of psychodrama, nothing like the Nutcracker. It's to do with a blind princess who is visited by a man with whom she gradually falls in love, and love cures her sight. It's a bit Freudian. You will only see if you want to see, and love is the transformation that will enable you. And a good production is very Freudian, wonderful, but nothing like the Nutcracker at all. So Tchaikovsky, in a way, is showing, I'm a virtuoso. I can do this kind of opera with psychological undertones, and I can do this kind of ballet, which is childhood, brightness, sweetness.
So was the book popular enough at the time that it would have like sold tickets? Is that kind of what they were thinking? Like everyone really likes the story. If they see the Nutcrackers coming, they'll come to it. Or was it really like they were inspired by it? That was the impetus.
Well, Hoffmann was not unknown in Russia. I mean, he was already quite popular. I don't know that he was a huge vote thing, but the Nutcracker was far from unknown. And what's more, he had been translated from his German into French by the great Alexandre Dumas. Mm-hmm. And it was Dumas who changed the name of the heroine from Marie to Clara. Mm-hmm. In Hoffmann, Clara is really the name of Marie's doll. But Dumas changed that, and that's why the ballet has Clara as the heroine in most versions.
I'm wondering, how much do you think being on this opera double bill impacted the initial reception? Because I feel like that's a lot. You know, you're like, you've already sat through a 90-minute opera that is completely different in tone, and then you're seeing the Nutcracker. So it's I
mean, when it was new, I think Yolanta was respectfully received. They were not ready for this over-the-top production by Petipa, or really the choreography was by Ivanov, but Petipa had set the plan, and he had worked with Zabolowski, who was the impresario of the Mariinsky Theatre, about what the designs would be. And it just seemed too sickly sweet too over the top in the decor and costumes for the Russian critics. The one thing they could see was that Tchaikovsky's music was really remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
They could hear, rather. But the production didn't fulfill that for them. They just weren't ready for it. I don't know that it was changed much over the years, though I think that ending about the bees got dropped pretty early on.
Uh-huh.
I don't think that's even in the notation which was brought to the West in the 20s by Sergeyev. When Sergeyev mounted the first Western Nutcracker at Sadler's Wells here in London, I remember asking people in when was it? I suppose the 90s, saying, were there bees at the ending? And they said, no, we hadn't.
So what happened next? It was not initially a hit. What was its next life beyond there?
Well, Tchaikovsky died the very next year. This is new in 1892. He died in 1893. He was the most successful composer Russia had ever had. Mm-hmm. So they went on repeating just about everything important by him, and the Nutcracker gradually became a habit. And as you know, young Balanchine danced in it. He appeared as a child in it. According to one bit of writing, he danced or played the role of the young prince, the Nutcracker prince, when he was 15. Mm. And then when he was a young adult, he played the role that we in Americans now call Candy Cane, the Trepak, which is a very interesting story altogether, because he inherited it really. It hadn't been choreographed by Ivanov. It was the one bit where Ivanov was in a hurry. And so he said to his colleague, what is his name? It's gone straight out of my head. I beg your pardon. Anyway, he said to this Russian colleague, please choreograph this number for me. The colleague did and stayed around for years. It's possible that he may have taught it to Balanchine. Balanchine certainly inherited the tradition pretty well step for step, because why can't I remember this man's name? He was also a pioneer in movie making, and he filmed both himself and his wife dancing, but he also filmed animation. And one way or the other, he recorded exactly how the steps for his beloved Trepak Candy Cane dance should go. And if you check that out, it's just about step for step what Balanchine reproduced in 1954 for his Candy Cane. There are one or two steps that have got changed, of course, over the years in Balanchine, but there is the silent film of Bobby Barnett, the original Candy Cane, doing it in silence. And I know he has coached Alexander Peters of Miami doing it. So it would be nice to know if Alex Peters is doing the Bobby Barnett version or whether he has to compromise and do a later version. I haven't been able to check. But I know he loved working with Bobby Barnett.
Right.
We'll have to ask him.
I think I would have preferred the Bobby Barnett version, because what I've heard is that until Dan Duell did it, there were no doubles.
Oh,
I think I remember.
Those are the worst.
Yeah. I mean, it was just like he was, I think, did he do gymnastics or something as a kid? And so he was just, I think, fooling around and could do it. And then Balanchine was like, okay, sure. So I love Dan Duell, but I will hold that against him for the rest of my life. As a dancer, I love seeing when people can do it.
All this has been on Facebook, because Daniel Duell does talk about it, and once in a blue moon, Bobby Barnett joins in the conversation. So I must check what he says. But at least he has filmed it for the Balanchine Foundation with Alex Peters. So check with Alex what he says.
All right,
sure.
We'll ask him.
Yeah. So in these early days of the Nutcracker being performed in Russia, about how often was it performed? Was it attached to a Christmas season as we know it? Or is that something that, like, the commercialization of Christmas happened later and people didn't do these traditions like that?
I think that got changed later. I don't know that it was a particular Christmas thing. But of course, it does have a Christmas party night one, so it's the best time of year to put it on, just for common sense. But I don't think Christmas was quite the shopping bonanza then.
Sure. So when did it become a tradition in the U.S.? What was the first U.S. Nutcracker?
Well, a lot has to do with Balanchine, but the Nutcracker suite itself had become popularized. Tchaikovsky didn't select those famous numbers that get into the suite, but as you will know better than me, people often talk about the Nutcracker suite as if it was the name of the ballet. They just know the highlights, and they think that's what it is. It's a very popular piece of music, and I think the first American stagings, probably in the early 40s, were just of the suite. And of course, Walt Disney choreographed a fabulous version of the suite in Fantasia, which I think is a lesson to everybody, because it shows you how you can be very musical and completely find something else in the music than what the scenario was originally about. Above all, I would hold up his Waltz of the Flowers, because it doesn't have flowers and it doesn't really have dancing in the sense, but I think it is as great as Balanchine. I have no higher praise. It is phenomenal, the Disney Waltz of the Flowers.
It is, it's true.
And all of his Nutcracker dances are just wonderful.
I actually wonder how much that went into, what was the time period there then when it started to become much more popular?
Fantasia is early 40s, is that right?
Fantasia is 1940.
Okay. Yeah.
I think
It's been around the same
the
time.
suite was often done in concerts anyway. Tchaikovsky, and you must remember, one of the most fabulous things is that Tchaikovsky was the most popular and acclaimed Russian composer outside Russia in history. And he came to America between composing Act 1 and Act 2. And I'm sure that entered the nervous system. He had one of the biggest successes of his career before he composed Act 2 when he was in America. But then there's this strange thing that also happened. On his way home to Russia, and he touched down in France, he found that his beloved sister, Sasha Davidova, had died. And she was an elder sister. She was like a surrogate mother to him. She had children. He was the best uncle to these children. And suddenly to lose this woman broke his heart. And there is a theory. Remember that one of the poignancies of traditional Nutcrackers is that Drosselmeyer, the magician of Act 1, never meets the Sugar Plum of Act 2. There's this tragic gap between them. And it's as if Tchaikovsky is Drosselmeyer and is dreaming of this creature he never meets. She has died implicitly. If you take a biographical reading of it, he's seeing his sister. And the musicologist Roland John Wiley, who wrote a very important book in 1985, Tchaikovsky's Ballets, which takes us into all three of Tchaikovsky's ballet, the music better than ever before, while researching the original productions. Wiley, not in his book, but elsewhere, when he was writing the book, wrote an essay called On Meaning in Nutcracker. And he believes that the rhythm of the pas de deux, the adagio, da-dum, ba-dum, ba-da-dum, those scaling scales, are taken from the memorial chant for the dead in Russian Orthodox Church. And he thinks that's exactly the rhythm that occurs with the chorus, the choir, when the dead are being remembered. So Tchaikovsky's thinking of, if you think it's such a strange bit of music to write for the Sugar Plum Fairy, it is tragic music in some way. Yeah. That's why. But he takes death and turns it into sublimity. You hear these falling scales with this extraordinary tragic rhythm again and again, and it becomes glorious. It's real occasional sublimation. I think I've gone way away from your original question, but we are kind of talking ground.
We wanted all the tangents. That's what we're here for. We want.
Tell me what your question was.
People have an idea. Like I think even many people, certainly people that listen to the podcast, have a base knowledge of maybe its history and background, but we want the B-sides,
Right.
The literal B-sides.
Let's dive into your tour of Nutcrackers a little bit. You already mentioned it briefly at the top, but how many did you see as part of this? What did you say, 11?
Oh, no, I did it maybe 2 before Thanksgiving, and I was pretty well on the go, so I saw at least 27 productions. I thought it was 28, but when I tried counting later, I could only think of 27. Maybe there's one I completely. I saw some of them, of course, more than once.
Mm-hmm.
It was the year that the Ratmansky one was new, and it was quite amazing to me to have seen my 25th Nutcracker the night before, which was the very good one in Richmond, Virginia, and then to turn up to BAM for the premiere of the Ratmansky production and thinking, well, let's see if I can find anything new in Nutcracker after all of what I've been doing. It was something like the 22nd of December, maybe the 23rd. There was I, ready for the Ratmansky Nutcracker. And then along comes, in his Waltz of the Snowflakes in Act 1, a twist I'd never heard before, because there is the voices off, the children's voices. Mm-hmm. Normally, no production ever responds to the voices. They're just an extra effect. Mm-hmm. Ratmansky absolutely brings out the voices, and they become the voices of the snowflakes. And at first, they are siren voices, luring the children to lie down in the snow. Mm-hmm. Then they become really much more cruel, dangerous voices when they return. And Ratmansky brings that out in the way that the children react to it and the way the snowflakes on stage behave. And I'm thinking, how many Nutcrackers have I seen? And for the first time, I'm really hearing what may be in these voices. Phenomenal.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the general lesson is there's just such a rich score. You can go way against, as Disney does, the original intention of the music, and you're going to find more. Tchaikovsky, from the overture onwards, is doing so many different things. I mean, I was listening to that overture that we think we know, and by the end, he's bringing in syncopation, where you think, I don't know where I am with the rhythms. He's starting with extra beats, and from then on, he's playing with duple time, triple time, against each other, blah, blah, right throughout the whole ballet. It's phenomenal.
Wow. Michael, have you seen it? Have you seen it?
I have not had the chance to. Yeah, I'm a big Alexi fan, but they're always in California doing it. I think,
right? Aren't they? Yeah.
They've done it here.
It was a BAM for 5 years, but it's not really a BAM type of Nutcracker. The BAM audience, which tends to be trendy, loves the Mark Morris Hard Nut. And that year, they had actually both the Mark Morris and the Ratmansky. The audience flocked to the Mark Morris.
Right.
It's the right audience. Whereas the ABT audience doesn't want to go to BAM. The ABT audience wants to go to Lincoln Center or City Center. They want Manhattan.
They don't want to leave Manhattan. So I'm curious, in the 27 productions, I mean, there must have been a really broad range of interpretations choreographically. But what would you say is some of the most surprising decisions, like the snow scene with Ratmansky? Like what else kind of like took you aback with some of the choices?
These are the satirical Nutcrackers, because of course there are ones that try to make it about sex, and they're just multi-fringe Nutcrackers, which have a lot of underwear, and it seemed like a fun idea. Actually, I find I'm sick of it after about one number. And I haven't even seen there are productions called the Slut Cracker and the Butt Cracker, and blah blah blah. I think I've mentioned the Russian tradition of Nutcracker of having the heroine danced by a young ballerina, and then you see her become the tutu grand ballerina in Act 2. That isn't done by many American productions, but America does have always touring Russian productions. I think I saw both something called the Great Russian Nutcracker and the Greatest Russian Nutcracker in the same year. They both had that basic idea. But my very first Nutcracker was a version of that, really, because it was Rudolf Nureyev's. I think it's now danced by the Paris Opera Ballet, but he originally staged it for the Swedish Ballet, and then in quick succession, the Royal Ballet took it on. And I saw it with Nureyev himself, and it's kind of Freudian. That is, Clara sits on Drosselmeyer's knee, as you might expect with the child and her godfather, except she's played by an adult ballerina, and the Drosselmeyer is played by Rudolf Nureyev, or the leading dancer of the company. And when it comes to the battle, the young Nutcracker is played by a young dancer, but adult in the company. After the battle, suddenly you see him transformed into, guess who? Rudolf Nureyev. Drosselmeyer becomes the Nutcracker prince. And After the battle, when that music changes and you begin the transformation music, there is Rudolf Nureyev, as I remember him, but I suppose I also saw David Wall doing the role, standing there, and then Clara bourrées back to join him. It used to be a very goosebump moment, to just bourrée in a, what's the word, wiggly line back towards, as if drawn by magic, until she was by his side. And Nureyev did something choreographically that was unusual in the 60s, which was of having a ballet where man and woman danced the same steps side by side, adagio, quite a lot. I can't remember if it went off into lifts, but I do remember them doing the same adagio steps a good deal. I think Ashton had initiated that in the dream, but Nureyev took it further.
There's some really bonkers stuff in that. It's popped up in an Instagram feed now and again, and I think it starts with a prolonged balance in arabesque, like they both just go up to susu and extend their leg, but it's like a 16 count balance, a choreographed balance.
Yeah,
I'm just like, really, how many people fall out of that?
If you see the film, and it was filmed with Mel Parker and Rudolf Nureyev, you can just see particularly that she is a little calculated. That wasn't how it felt live. It really was theatrical magic. If you didn't know your Nutcracker and you weren't a connoisseur, I was straight away into the goosebump aspect of Nutcracker. When I later got to know other Nutcrackers, I thought, I don't need this Freudian take. And they really went Freudian stuff, by the way. Act 2 was retold so that she kind of was haunted by her family in the form of bats, and she had to fend off her family to find true love with Rudolph.
So I'm thinking about these different interpretations that you saw. And one thing that I did want to ask you about was the additional music that Balanchine's version adds in. So I have two questions. Tell us a little bit about how that came about, that Balanchine added that. And then did you find any other productions that added music in unexpected places?
Yes, there have been at least 2 other productions that added other music. Balanchine's was probably the first. But I seem to remember that the old Kent Stowell production for the Pacific Northwest Ballet added some music from the Queen of Spades. And maybe Memphis Ballet had some music from Eugene Onegin, the opera also. But Balanchine started it, and he did it simply because he needed more music for a scene change. Yeah. And being a clever man, he found exactly the right piece of music that was in those days almost never heard from the Sleeping Beauty. It's an entr'acte just for scene change in Sleeping Beauty, and it's orchestral, but it features in particular a solo violin. So it's like a concerto. And Mariinsky had a very famous leading violinist in those days, Leopold Auer, who was the great virtuoso of the day, and he played this. Balanchine brilliantly revived this music, but he makes it not just an entr'acte, not just scenery music at all. He takes you right into the heart of the Nutcracker, which is such an extraordinary thing to do to music that isn't from the Nutcracker. He takes you into the drama for little Marie, Clara, looking for her Nutcracker with this Nutcracker, which is still a doll. And then her mother coming when Marie is asleep on the chaise longue and coming to look after her, and very touching, putting this, what we call it, shawl over her daughter to make sure she's safe for the night. Little does she know what's going to happen. And then up comes Drosselmeyer, the godfather, who makes sure that the scene is ready for magic. Also touchingly fitted to the music. How Balanchine did that that's part of his genius. And he could do it because the violin music involves something like the same rising scale figure that we've heard in the Christmas tree music. So there is a connection. You can tell you're listening to non-Nutcracker music because the instrumentation is different. There is a slight jolt, but it's only a slight one.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If you're a purist and you're used to European Nutcrackers, I can tell you that interpolation is a major shock. And when that was first seen in Britain, everybody was going, "Oh!" Once you get used to it in America, it's great. But
right. Yeah. Something I think that moment is so beautiful, and it's interesting as background info for people that did not ever perform in this production. It's one of the most coveted roles among women in the company. Everyone is like begging to do that part. Rebecca danced that part many times. And it's just something that I think
the mother.
Yes. Yeah. Rebecca, you can speak to it. Like, what makes everyone want to dance that?
It's such a fun role, and it's cool to interact with the Marie so much. And that moment really was like one of my favorite moments of doing the role too, was being able to have that moment. You walk at least in Miami's production, you walk in front of the scrim, like you're looking for her. So you're kind of outside, in the hallway, and then you come around and then you're in the back room where she is and looking for her. And it's just such a fun role to do. It makes party scene a little more fun, but I always love doing that, unless you had to do Snow right after, which is a nightmare because you have to take your hair down for that moment and then you have to put it back up, and like all you have is battle scene. So if that happens, it was a little less fun.
Around New York City Ballet, there used to be people who would keep a litany of all the details that had changed to Balanchine's Nutcracker since Balanchine died.
Really?
And one of them is that Heather Watts, around the time that she filmed the mother in that 1993 one with Darcy Kissler's The Sugar Plum, Heather Watts is the mother there, that she played the mother with her hair already done, as if she was on her way to bed.
She started it?
Her daughter. And it's been a moot point at City Ballet ever since whether the mother should have her hair down or not.
Oh, I think it's so nice because, and then we at Miami City Ballet, we had like a little bonnet that we would put over. Sometimes I would do like fake hair so that it, and you could hide it kind of underneath. But I thought that was like it was casual.
I don't think Heather was thinking she might go on in the snowflakes afterwards.
I don't think she was doing that.
It had been a minute for her.
She wasn't worried about that, no. I want to know, and I don't know if you can
interrupt, but there is another reason why that's so touching, is that, of course, Balanchine lost his mother very early on. He went to boarding school. He seldom saw her after he went to the Mariinsky school and never saw her once he left Russia. And you can read a lot of Balanchine's life as a longing for the woman he lost early on in his life. And I think in his great relationship with his friendship with Karen von Roldegem, a very romantic friendship, she had a German name very like that of his mother, I think. So there's all kinds of maternal connections going on in Balanchine.
Yeah. I had read that before. I had heard that maybe, I don't know that he ever literally said that Karen reminded him of his mother, but in John Clifford's book, there's this little just a bit at the end where he's talking about when Balanchine was really, in and out mentally. The one person he would always want to talk to was Karen, and he would call, they used to, I guess, have a landline, the stage manager. He would call the stage manager while Karen was performing. Oh. And in between entrances, she would pick up the line and just talk to him. Like, and of course you think like when you're leaving the world, like that's something very common, like you want your mother.
And more moving than that is a tale in Jacques d'Amboise's memoir, I'm a Dancer, where he talks about how people passed the dying Balanchine really with Karen von Roldegem cradling his head in her arms and singing a German lullaby to him. And I think Jacques himself says every bit of generosity and love that Balanchine gave her, she gave back, and she looked after him at the end. It's very, very touching.
Crying.
Sidetracked for tears. There's always time for tears so on the
beautiful.
podcast.
Yeah, exactly. That's so beautiful. Okay.
Think of other, and to give you examples of the new details you can keep finding in the score, one that I never expected was in the Kent Stowell Pacific Northwest production. If you listen to the beginning of Act 2, as you arrive at the Sugar Plum Kingdom, the Kingdom of Sweets, there's a wonderful effect of the piccolos, the woodwind, doing sort of upward shrieks, and it's full of like childish excitement. Well, the Kent Stowell production, which was designed by Maurice Senbeck, at that point had dolphins leaping out of the waves, and they leaped exactly on those shrieks and the woodwind. And
cute.
I always miss them every time I hear that music now.
That's funny.
I love that.
Example is in the Mark Morris production. I don't think his version of the Sugar Plum solo with that Celestia is on the whole my favorite. And it's danced barefoot by the adult playing Little Marie. But the end of all that Celesta phrase, there's a bassoon figure, there is at the end.
Right.
And normally no choreographic version responds to the diddly-om. But Mark Morris has that kind of slump with emotion at that moment. And so I always think of Mark Morris every time I hear the diddly-om figure.
You just were speaking about the Sugar Plum Fairy, and it made me think, how many productions have the same trajectory like Balanchine's does, where the Sugar Plum Fairy dances her variation with the angels at the very beginning, and then the pas de deux is just the pas de deux and the coda. Is that common?
I think that's only Balanchine has the nerve to do that.
Yeah.
Balanchine, that's supposedly so musical, is the one who often takes the biggest liberties. He brings in music from another ballet, as we've said, Sleeping Beauty. He cuts a solo, the solo for the Sugar Plum Cavalier. His proper name is Prince Coqueluche.
I've never heard that. I didn't know that. That's wild.
I don't remember what it used to be translated wrongly as Prince Whooping Cough, and somebody pointed out actually it's really the name of a delicacy, but I can't remember what kind of delicacy it is. Anyway, and then he moves the Sugar Plum solo, which is kind of wrong because Tchaikovsky knew that his greatest effect was bringing in the Celesta, which had never been heard in Russia before.
Right. And
he was terrified that Rimsky-Korsakov might discover the Celesta and play it in Russia before he did in the Nutcracker. So he kept it as secret as he could. And he brings it in very late in Act Two, in the context that Tchaikovsky meant it. So to bring it in earlier robs it of some of the suspense. And that should, of all the many magic sounds we hear in Act Two, the Celesta should be the last of them, after we've heard all the other suites and so forth. So Balanchine is in a way undermining the music in that respect, but of course he is doing other things dramatically by making us know the Sugar Plum at the beginning of Act Two, and showing her establishing magic and her extraordinary connection with these child angels.
Right. So sometimes when dancers are given permission to do Balanchine's choreography on a gig, at a local production, dancers that who perform it within the companies they are associated with, the gig will ask them to do it as a traditional pas de deux, not have the Sugar Plum variation in the beginning. And the people that have to do that, they're it is death.
It was so hard.
To do the Balanchine pas de deux, and then the women have, because that that little tarantella, the coda is, or sorry, not the coda, but the male solo rather is it's about a minute long or less than a minute, and then so the women have to do pas de deux, tiny break, hard solo, hard coda.
It's crazy.
I think that's quite standard for people, but I also know that at New York City Ballet, maybe true at Miami, that men found it killing to go just straight from the adagio into the coda.
Yes.
It's one of the hardest changes, which is what Balanchine asks.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like a unique, different challenge. Yeah.
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 Yeah. You'll notice, it's funny. I always think, I've actually seen this as a note. People will be like, okay, can you please walk to the corner a little bit faster?
Yeah.
The men are always trying to take their time to get a breather in.
Yeah, it's true. Alastair, if you had to choose, what would be your favorite production of the Nutcracker?
I can tell you all the things that are wrong in the Balanchine, but it is to me the most satisfying nonetheless. And I have watched it dozens and dozens of times, and the faults don't go away, and it still doesn't matter. It is just a larger journey of the spirit than any other. And if there is a scene that I could single out, it is the one in which nobody dances. It is the one I've been describing, the transformation with the sleeping heroine fainted, traveling on her mysterious bed around the stage, and then this Nutcracker coming in sideways out of the wings, looking so strange, and then suddenly this fabulous metamorphosis. And the fact that he arrives in Tondu's side says so much. Tondu with Balanchine is always a magic sign.
Right. So I love that moment as well. I think it's so, aside from the tree growing, it's the most emotional moment in the ballet for me. And I was really, this past weekend when I saw Miami City Ballet, I was, really feeling the feelings, and you see the prince step out, and, of course I know what's about to happen, but I had never, ever seen this happen before. The poor thing got, the costume almost took him back off stage when it peeled away from his body.
Oh no.
He went with it and he had to like yank himself away. The audience was like, oh, okay, we did it. And he immediately, once it was sorted out, the audience burst into applause. And,
Right.
but it's a very special moment. But until that show, I didn't realize that it was complicated.
That's so funny.
And Balanchine also solves brilliantly the Waltz of the Flowers. As you may remember, I wrote about that in the New York Times. But that is the hardest single dance number to choreograph. When you've seen 27 productions that I did that year, but I've also seen many other Nutcrackers, most choreographers just run out of ideas after 2-3 minutes, and you're just more of the same, or they're taking each idea a little too long. Balanchine moves on every 20 seconds. It's really phenomenal.
Yeah.
I find even very good choreographers like Mark Morris, I find they're a little too simple there. There are other very good snowflakes waltzes, and I wish somebody would reconstruct Ivanov's, because we have that in notation. Originally, the Royal Ballet production was said to be Ivanov's. It's not at all. It's just taken one or two ideas from notation, but they're all musically wrong. Doug Fullington will do it if he can find about 50 dancers.
That makes me think, though, about Snow. Was that very common to have because Balanchine's version doesn't have a Snow Queen or a Snow King? Is that very common, or was that because that's one thing I always thought was so cool about it, was really just the core, like spotlight on the core. There's so few moments really where there's
that was Petipa's idea, just a quarter ballet of Snow. There was no Snow Queen in his version. And as far as I know, there were maybe there were snowflakes in ballets that we don't know about. There's so many 19th century ballets that are long lost. I think Jane Pritchard, the British historian, feels that there was a snowflake dance by the French choreographer Henri Justement, who was also something of a notator. So Petipa may have been picking up on ideas that, thank God he did, because we only know his version now, which, as I said, Ivanov choreographed when Petipa fell ill.
Yeah.
But another thing that's wonderful to go on watching is most productions around America use not the Balanchine pas de deux, but the Ivanov pas de deux.
Right.
How close it is to Ivanov, we don't know. It's slightly different wherever you see it. But my favorite figure, it's also done at the Royal Ballet, to the first huge statement of that descending scale. You already heard the descending scale about 4 times, but now it comes back in big force. And the ballerina prepares ton du front, and then she runs to her cabaret, and then with her back to the audience, which is so strange in 19th century ballet, she does a quick développé à la seconde with her arms en couronne. And then she peels down into penché. Now, if that's well phrased, that peeling from the high seconde and the arms en haut in fifth to go down to penché absolutely matches the scale in the music. But it took me a lot of listening before I suddenly read, I see what Ivanov's doing. He's really responding to the pattern in the music. And different ballerinas will phrase that in a different way. I also once, on my marathon, suddenly saw it as an image of a fruit, with your arms open like, a flower or something, and then suddenly it peeling open as if it was the opening of petals. And that was fabulous too.
Thank you for that demonstration. I wish everyone could have seen that. That was very beautiful. You were demonstrating the movements for us.
It reminded me that I danced that when I was like 13. I hadn't thought about that until exactly that moment with your demonstration. I could see my partner doing that at me.
Another fabulous moment in the Balanchine that comes from the original is the moment when she steps onto a disc that magically carries her across the stage. Now, that came from the Mariinsky, and I think Balanchine told some people, I don't know if this is historically true, that there really would be stagehands underneath the ballerina who would travel, absolutely carrying her from one side of the stage to another. And of course, you never saw the stagehands, but there they were underneath the foot.
Wow.
Now it seems so simple, so they've just got a sliding disc, but they needed propulsion in those days.
Yeah. Right. I love that there's so much of the magic in Nutcracker is just so simple. I mean, it's a sliding disc. It's just, a little bit wider than what a point shoe is. And then, the bed scene, which we've already discussed as being so beautiful, is just a man under a bed pushing it, know? But when you're a kid and you see it for the first time, I'm just like, how do you do that? Like, is there like a trap door that's just moving? It's so cool how simple it is. Like,
As you know, a lot of
obvious
the magic
information.
of Nutcracker is really to do with the mothers that we never see behind the stage, because every performance has so many Nutcrackers in the audience, so many mothers, sorry, in the audience. And when Peter Bowl first danced the Sugar Plum Cavalier, I think I was there in 1983. It was the year that Balanchine had died. No, 1985, I beg your pardon. I was over there that year. There was some mothers from standing room, and one said, "Oh, I remember him in this role. I remember him that role." And one mother said, "I remember him when he was the bed." Yes, Peter Bowl, the bean boy underneath the bed.
See, bed boys, they're essential, and they do other things too, not just the bed boy.
Well, thank you so much, Alastair, for taking us on this journey through Nutcracker history. I know I can't wait to see another Nutcracker later this season.
I see my first on Saturday. Good.
Oh, good. Yay. Well, yes, I hope that everyone enjoys.
America is the place to Nutcracker. I do love watching so many productions there. Yeah. And I have seen Clara and the Nutcracker, or Clara getting into a yellow cab at the end of the ballet.
That's so good. Thank you, Alastair, so much.
Happy Christmas to you.
All right. Take care.